Hello everyone, in this video we're going to talk about Isaiah 11. Isaiah 11 is an exciting chapter, and let me give you a recap before we dive in, just to give you a basic idea of the flow, what was happening and how we got to chapter 11. Remember, chapter 7 through 12 is one unit, but I'm not going to actually review from chapter 7, but I'm going to review from 9-10. And from 9-10 to 10-4 we talked about Judah's distrusting God, which will bring near total destruction by the hand of Assyria. But Assyria too will come under judgment. That was bulk of chapter 10. But out of judgment on Assyria, the remnants of Jacob will return. That's 10:20 through 34. And now we reach chapter 11. The return of the remnants will be under the aegis of an anointed descendant of David. Okay, so we're going to talk about here in this chapter, this righteous branch that's going to come up, and the return of the people are going to happen under his rulership. Okay, but today we're going to do something a little different, because I want you to look at chapter 11 of Isaiah before I dive in. Just look at it on your pages. And if you notice, chapter 11 is mostly formatted in a poetic format. Okay? It's center aligned. Okay, I use the ESV. Some versions do it a little differently, but it's mostly poetic, center aligned. Okay, and we do this because scholars do see some sort of meter that is spotted in this chapter that helps them know that this is a poetry. It's a prophecy in a poetic format. But if you look at verse 10 and 11, there is this prose, this non-poetic section. In my ESV, it is formatted as justified, not center-aligned, but it's left-aligned, like a normal novel book, right? Not in a poetic format. It's because they don't quite see these two verses to be in a poetic format. And why do I say this? Chapter 11 is very interesting because of the structure. Its structure is much discussed, and that's why it's interesting. But long story short, verses 10 and 11 are not an abrupt intrusion to the flow of the poetry, but verse 10 ends the first half of the chapter, which is from verses 1 through 10. Verse 11 opens the second half of the chapter, which goes from verse 11 through 16. Does that make sense? So 10 and 11, 10 ends the first section, 11 opens the next section. In other words, chapter 11 is divided in two parts. First has its own theme we'll talk about, and second has its own theme. Okay? But before we move on to each of the themes, look at verse 10. In that day. Okay? And look at verse 11. In that day. We have these two verses that both start with in that day. And so far, in that day had been a little scary, because in that day judgment would come. But here in this chapter, in that day, good things will happen. Okay? But there are two things that the author is trying to highlight, as we see from the structure that he had intended to write in that there are two things that he wants to highlight what would happen in that day. The first is spoken of in verses 1 through 10. And what is it? What does he say in verses 1 through 10? It's really much about the universal aspect of the stump of Jesse. What do I mean by this? There's going to be this, right? This Emmanuel, this child, this Messiah that's going to come, who's going to be Prince of Peace and everything. And here in this chapter, he describes him in terms of stump of Jesse. And what's he going to do? What's going to happen when that stump comes? And he explains that in the whole chapter 11. But in the first half, he emphasizes the universal aspect of it. The worldwide status of the stump. Okay? In the second half of chapter 11, verses 11 through 16. Okay, the second half of 11, the implication of the coming of the stump of Jesse is more restricted to the people of Israel. We see terms like Judah, Ephraim, and so on. Okay, we'll hit the details more when we dive into the sections, but note that chapter 11 is divided into two sections. First half is really talking mostly about the implication, the aftermath, the implication of the coming of the stump that is relevant for the Gentiles, for the world. Second half of 11 talks about the implication of his coming for the people of Israel. All right, one more thing before we move on to the verse-by-verse exposition. I want you to look at verses 1 and 2. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. Now, move on to verse 10. In that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. I don't know if you caught it, but there are three words that's repeated in verses 1 and 2 and in verse 10. Jesse, root, and rest. This is important because it forms an inclusio. We see that the author intended verses 1 through 10 to be read as a unit. Inclusio, remember, there's that sandwich structure. And we see the same kind of inclusio once again in verses 11 and 16. Okay? In verses 11, in the day the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlines of the sea. And now skip down to verses 15 and 16. We have the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and so on. There will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant that remains of his people will come up to, and so on. The point is, the verses 11 and 16 and 15 repeat the words they, hand, the remnant, Assyria, Egypt, and sea. So once again, we see another inclusio between verses 11 and 16, as well as in verses 1 and 10. Once again, showing the fact that this chapter is to be understood in these two chunks. Okay, verse 1. Let's go into verse 1. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. If you look actually the verse above, which is the last verse of chapter 10, we end with the note, he will cut down the thickets of the forest with an axe, and Lebanon will fall by the majestic one. So in chapter 10, we have destruction of Assyria done by God in the imagery of a forest being chopped down by an axe. In chapter 11, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse. We see that Isaiah is continuing this imagery of the forest, but while Assyria's pride will become like a chopped up forest, Jacob's will also be like that, destroyed, but it will be different in that nothing ever arose from Assyria's stumps, but not so with Israel. From one of her stumps will come a shoot and the restoration of the nation. So we see this interesting continuation of this imagery of forestry, chopping down, and so on, that was applied to Assyria. Now it will be applied to Israel, but in a much more positive way, of course. Another way, by the way, to understand this is by understanding this chapter 11, verse 1 as a reference to the Song of the Vineyard in chapter 5. I tend to kind of see it that way, but not a lot of people see it that way. But I see that the stump of Jesse, the shoot from the stump of Jesse will come out in the imagery, in the context of the Song of the Vineyard in chapter 5. But doesn't really matter. All right. Verse 2, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the stump, the shoot, and the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Pause here. So Isaiah is telling us when everything is destroyed, there's going to be the Messiah is going to come. But one of the most important things about this Messiah is that Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. Okay, and the Spirit of wisdom, Spirit of counsel, Spirit of knowledge. It all really are different ways to refer to the Spirit of the Lord. And this is why Jesus started his ministry with being baptized by John the Baptist. And then we saw the Spirit of the Lord came upon him like a dove when he came out of the water. And also in Luke 4, in his famous synagogue speech in Nazareth, he quotes an Isaiah passage, not this one, but a different Isaiah passage, but also talks about this coming of the Spirit of the Lord and so on. And Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and people get upset about it and so on, right? So this Spirit of the Lord being upon this messianic figure is going to be important. And later on in history, through many other prophets like Joel, Zechariah, and so on, we see that the Spirit of the Lord will not be limited to the Messiah himself, but will come upon everybody. Everybody will have the Spirit of the Lord, and they will dream dreams and prophesy, and so on. And of course, this will connect to Acts 1 and 2, where the Spirit of the Lord is to be coming upon them, and Jesus tells them to wait in Jerusalem and so on. But anyway, so this stump of Jesse will have the Spirit of the Lord. That's an important characteristic of it. And his delight shall be, verse 3, in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. So until now we are getting some descriptions of this stump of Jesse, who's going to be covered with the Spirit of the Lord and be righteous and so on. Moving on to verse 6, this is kind of interesting. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So when that stump of Jesse comes, we see these wolf and calf and everything is going to be changed. There are two ways to understand this. There's some people understand this literally, where the restoration, the changes would occur and reach even to the created world, like the animals. So all the animals won't be killing each other. They will become herbivores. Some other people understand this as a figurative way, where wolf dwelling with the lamb is an imagery of the strong will not hurt the weak. At an individual level or at a national level, the strong country will not oppress the weak country. Certainly both interpretations are possible. I kind of like that literal one, but verse 9 gives me a little bit of a hard time. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So, they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain sounds like it's more of a political thing. They, as in they, the enemies of Israel, will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. More so than it sounds like the wolf shall not hurt the lamb in my holy mountain. So there is another part in Isaiah that talks about these animals being restored. Perhaps there it could be more understood literally, but here it could be literal. Again, it is not a closed route, but verse 9 makes me wonder if this is meant to be understood figuratively. But doesn't really matter. Either way, it makes sense. Even if it's literal fulfillment, we see this restoration of the Garden of Eden, perhaps. If it's political entity, it still makes sense. All right, verse 10. In that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. So this Messiah, this stump of Jesse, is going to stand as a signal for the peoples. So somehow he will function as the banner around whom the people will gather. Okay? And nations will inquire. This is once again the echo of Isaiah 2:3 and 4. Kimitzion tetzeh Torah, for from Zion the law shall go forth, and the nations will go up and worship God together. This is another way of repeating that verse from chapter 2. So that was the first half of chapter 11. Second half of chapter 11, I will cover in the next video.